All right, thanks everyone for staying here on a Saturday morning. And my name is Duanyi. I'm an assistant professor at the Cornell IOR School. And it is my great honor to be here to share my joint work with Tingting Zhang, who is our only audience online, on a paper we called The Voice Without Representation, Worker Voice in China's Networked Public Sphere. So I want to say this is also a work in progress, and we welcome any comment you may have on either the framing or the findings of this paper. All right, so the motivation of our paper is driven by the fact that in recent years, there has been a rise of alternative worker voice enabled by the advancement in the information communication technology. So for example, the Fight for 15 and the Our Walmart movement in the United States has demonstrated workers' ability to use social media in order to exercise their voice and to organize even beyond the organizational boundaries. But despite this proliferation of worker voice enabled by the social media, and both the scholars in the OB, that is the organizational behavior, and the industrial relation literature, has been only focused on the worker's voice towards management or the worker's voice within the organizational boundaries. So for example, in the organizational behavior literature, scholars has been focused on workers' individual expression of voice towards betterment in order to improve their organization's performance. And in contrast, the industrial relations scholars has been focused on the collective formal mechanisms of worker voice, mostly through the collective bargaining or through the union's grievance system, in order to advance workers' own interest instead of the interest of their organizations. And we believe that from either perspective, either OB or IR, the worker voice on social media is a very new and very different channels for workers to improve the organizational process and also to assert their own interest. So so in this paper, we are trying to do two things. So firstly, we are trying to conceptualize this kind of new worker voice that is emerging in social media. And we want to compare this new type of voice with the traditional voice in the existing OB and IR literature. And secondly, we want to test whether the worker voice on social media have any tangible effect on working conditions. And similar to the paper by Chris, we analyze the source of powers of this two new type of voice and compare it with the traditional voice in OB and IR. And also we also identified a few limitations of this new kind of voice. And some of the limitations is universal. It applies to both a democratic and authoritarian country like China, but some of the limitations is unique in the Chinese context. So I will go over all of this source of power and limitations in a second. All right, so first of all, let's firstly look at the traditional worker voice. So in the traditional OB or IR literature, scholars has been focused on the voice that is unilaterally vertical. So that means that the workers voice towards management and in order to change their organizational practice. And the source of power, we believe, that is stemmed from the traditional voice is either from the workers' individual structural power, which is workers' position in the production system, and workers can use, for example, their skills and their ability to find alternative jobs in order to bargain with their employees to say, oh, if you do not accept my suggestions towards, for example, improve my wage or improve the organizational process, I'm going to leave the organization. Or workers can use their collective associational power to organize a union or to use a grievance channel to force the employers to change the organizational practice. But in comparison, we argue that worker voice on social media has demonstrated a very different structure. We say it is it shows a network structure, and the workers' voice targeted audience is no longer the management, but their voice is toward the general public, the other workers around the nation, or even the public policy and lawmakers. So the source of power workers utilize is based on their correlational power through naming and shaming, or the ideational power through collective identity building, or the institutional power through public policy making. So firstly, let's look at the first power resources we identified here, which is the correlational power. So the first pathway between the worker's voice on social media and the their working condition is towards the relationship between the voice and correlational power, and then workers build correlational power that in turn change their working conditions. So workers can build correlations with the public by voicing their grievances on social media. And this means that the public is going to recognize the firm's violations of the labor rights by listening to the worker's voice on social media. And this correlational power can pressure the firms to respond to the workers' demand on social media, and firms will perhaps voluntarily or involuntarily to improve their labor conditions. So for example, in the United States, we all learned that the Me Too movement significantly raised the public awareness and sympathies towards raise the public awareness of sexual violence or sexual harassment in the workplace. And the employers, after the Me Too movement, they adopt a lot of anti-sexual harassment policies in the organization. So we believe this is one example demonstrating the worker voice on social media's correlational power in the organization. So secondly, we believe that worker voice on social media can also strengthen the ideological power of workers. By saying we define ideology power as workers' capacity to influence the other actors' normative or cognitive beliefs through the use of the ideational element. So in particular, the worker voice on social media has created we call it a public town hall for workers to discuss very diverse ideas, very different values, and very different demands in public. And it is possible that workers can reach a shared understanding and form a collective identity around workplace issues. So for example, in the 5 for 15 movement, we have observed that workers has the 5 for 15 has attracted public attention because it is created a normative symbols for establishing the legitimacy of the $15 hourly wage. And thirdly, we believe that worker voice on social media can increase workers' institutional power, because in a lot of the democratic countries, the government the government has to be accountable and respond to the public opinions. And the politicians are usually very sensitive to the social media's campaigns, and the government may establish new laws, or they may pass new regulations in order to improve the working conditions in the workplace. So I think thus far I have established the 3 different pathways for worker voice to influence the working conditions through the correlational power, and through the ideational power building, and through the institutional power. But I want to say that those 3 power resources also suffers from major limitations. So the first limitation is, I think, in the social media literature, people has been very critical of worker voice on social media, because they say, oh, maybe workers only the public attention only got attracted after some major negative event, and maybe the Me Too movement effect is very short-lived, and public attention got attracted right after some negative event. Maybe some woman got harassed in the organization, but those kind of movements, sometimes it fails to foster any deep commitment, or it fails to mobilize any kinds of offline actions. And secondly, for the ideational power, some people argue that worker voice on social media provide worker opportunity to share very different perspective. But on the other hand, workers' voice can become a very contested, the voice can become like very contested, and workers can share like very different opinions. And those kind of opinions can become like a field of battle of ideas. And it is really, there's a need for a coordinator in order to help workers to recognize that their experience is a result of a common structural position. So without a coordinator, or without an orchestrator to help the workers recognize they have a shared experience, sometimes worker voice on social media cannot be translated into tangible offline actions. Now let's think about the context in China. So for those of you who is familiar with the labor movement in China, so you all understand that the independent organizing is forbidden in China. So there's only one formal trade union in China, which is the All China Federation of Trade Union, ACFTU. And any kind of organizing or any NGO activities is it's heavily suppressed or forbidden in the context of China. So back to my last point about the importance of coordinator or orchestrator, there's very little room for the labor NGOs or for the independent worker organizers to work in China in order to help the workers to transform their online activities to offline actions in the organization. So, and in addition, the previous literature also identified the so-called the state capital alliance, which means that the Chinese government usually, when there's a conflict between workers and organization, usually the government may favor the firm's flexibility and autonomy, and they may prioritize the development of the economy, and they may suppress the advancement of the workers' interest. So I think this is and in this setting, we may not observe that workers' voice on social media can lead to any tangible changes in the organization. So here is our setting. So in order to examine how the worker voice on social media affect working conditions, we studied the anti-996 movement in China. So the anti-996 movement means that in the technology sector, it is there is an explicit expectation or even a job requirement to ask for the programmers in China to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and 6 hours a day. And this exploitative working condition has led to a group of programmers to launch a protest online. So it's called the 996 ICU movement, which means that in 96 hours, and it is very likely that you will be end up in the ICU in the hospital. So a group of workers organized in GitHub and other social media platforms, and the anti-996 movement has drawn global attentions in March 2019, and when workers established this 996 ICU in GitHub. So in order to understand whether this online movement has any tangible effect on the offline organizational practice, we collected a large number of, firstly, we collected a large of social media postings on Zhihu, which is the largest question and answer website in China from 2019 and 2021. So this data set include more than 2,000 questions and more than 400,000 comments from the social media users. And secondly, because we think, oh, maybe there's a selection bias in this social media sample. So maybe the people who participate in the online discussion is a selective sample. So maybe those people are like-minded and they are likely to complain about the workplace issue. So secondly, we collected 70 semi-structured interviews with the programmers from 4 major cities in Beijing, Shanghai, Hangzhou, and Shenzhen in 2022. Since this research was conducted during the pandemic, so we did not do the interview in person. So how we recruit workers is like we invited people in LinkedIn, the Chinese version of LinkedIn. We sent over 2,000 invitations on LinkedIn to see, whether we can connect with you and learn about your work experience. And about 900 people agreed to connect with us. And out of those people, we select 70 people to interview in this study. And thirdly, to supplement this social media and interview data, we also collected a large number of articles from state-affiliated news outlets from 2019 to 2021. So for example, the People's Daily is a state-run newspaper article because we do not have access to do interviews with the government officials. We think that maybe to analyze the newspaper can give us a sense about how the states is respond to workers' demand on social media. All right, so here is the result. So firstly, we want to measure the correlational power of worker voice on social media, and we want to learn how does the public attention got attracted by workers' voice on social media, and how does that train. So we did some very descriptive plotting of the number of unique posts and comments on Zhihu. Okay, 2 minutes. All right. So we see that the public attention got dropped, got attracted to the 996 issues only after there's some negative event going on. So the first peak of the social media discussion happened right after Jack Ma, which is the CEO of Alibaba, made a comment like, oh, the workers should even work harder. The workers should believe that 996 is a blessing instead of a kind of exploitation. And another spike of the anti-996 movement happened also after some negative events. So for example, in 2021, there was a 22-year-old girl committed suicide in Pinduoduo, which is a parent company of Temu in the United States. And after those negative events, we see that the public attention has been attracted after those events. And in our interviews, when we ask the workers about, oh, how do you think about voice your grievances in social media, and do you think that using social media is an effective tool to change organizational practice? A lot of our interviewees agree that the social media discussion tends to wane unless there are unless there are significant events going on. So for example, one worker said, oh, there might be some measure introduced after negative events in our organization, such as designating 1 day a week as a no overtime day or urging everyone to leave work on time. However, these measures are typically only generally implemented during initial period after the incidents come to light. And after a while, they often become superficial and overtime continues as usual. So this shows that we do not see enough evidence on committed correlational power building in this case. And the voice on social media is usually issue-driven and short-lived. And it is very difficult to overcome the so-called collectivism associated with social media discussion. All right, so secondly, we look at the engagement pattern on social media. So basically, we look at how do workers interpret the overtime practices and whether the battle of ideas has the ability to reach a consensus and to improve the the identity building in the organizations. So what we did is we selected a 1% sample of social media posting, and we also analyzed our 70 interviews. And we look at this question about whether the workers believe that the 996 work schedule is justified and whether workers themselves interpret overtime is a grievance or not. So I think for a lot of the audience in the United States, maybe you feel like, oh, of course, this is a grievance. But to our surprise, a lot of the workers do not interpret the overtime issue as a grievance at the beginning.
I will ask you to wrap up, please. Thank you.
Some people believe that, okay, I think the 996 actually reflect the entrepreneurial mindset, and I don't mind to work overtime. And some people believe that in the current context of economic slowdown in China, working overtime is actually necessary for the national development and even the geopolitical competition with the United States. So, and lastly, we look at the institutional power of social media. And again, I think the workers have very controversial ideas about this idea. And some workers believe that the institutional intervention should be a powerful tool to change the organizational practice. But on the other hand, some workers have significant concerns about the government incentive to enforce the overtime law. Since I don't have time to go over the quotes, so I will just jump to the conclusion. So yeah, so I
30 seconds.
Yeah, I don't want to be over pessimistic about media's voice in China, but because the social media discussion does have some effect to shape the China's national conversation around overwork, and more people has been aware of the overtime issues in China. However, we believe that the worker voice online failed to transform into the organizational practice change because of the lack of the three type of power I just described. And the critical component that is missing in the case of the anti-996 movement, we believe is the presence of an orchestrator or a coordinator in order to facilitate workers' voice on social media. And without any grassroots mobilization supported by workers' associational power, we find that the worker voice on social media did not really transform into workplace solidarity or lead to any of the policy changes